No? Oh, there we go. All right. Before I forget, I know it will be said in announcements, but today is the deadline to sign up for CYC. First thing in the morning when I come in, I'm going to register us and get us a place to stay. So if you don't get that information into me by today, you're going to miss the boat. So please get that information into me today. I have to say that this week has been a pretty good week. A week ago, Sunday, we had cookies and coffee at the Livingston's house. They opened up their house to anyone and everyone that wanted to come. Wednesday, they opened up their house again to the young at heart, and we had a Christmas party of sorts. We ate and played some games, and we had a good time. Let's see here. Thursday, the young at heart got together again, and they made goodie bags for the shut-ins. Thursday night, we had a youth devo at the Patterson's house, and like another Christmas party type thing. And then Friday night, the Young at Heart's been busy this week. Friday night, we went to see Showdown, which is a band that Randy Fowler's in. And I have to say, Thursday night devo with the teens, I had everyone back by 9:30, okay? And then last night, Friday night, I think we rolled in about 11 o'clock with the Young at Heart. So they stayed out later than our teens. Something that they told me at Freed Hardman is that any young minister has what they call their theological hammer, okay? They try to be profound in everything that they say. And they, like I said, this hammer, that they try to hit you over the head with it. So today, I'm not going to be profound. I'm not going to hit you over the head with my theological hammer, per se. But today, I'm just going to preach to you Jesus, and that'll be the sermon. The introduction to Jesus was that Jesus was born to a virgin, which is crazy, you know, someone who hasn't done the things you have to do to have a baby. And he was born to a carpenter, which therefore made him a carpenter. He started his ministry when he was around 30 years old. He started off by collecting 12 people. Those 12 people would end up being some of his best friends that he would ever have in his lifetime. He healed the sick and the blind, and he performed miracles that no one else had ever done. And more so than that, he gave people hope, as in he used words like ecclesia, which means called out. Reed Swindle, a preacher in Corinth, Mississippi, went to Jerusalem, and he said, in the back of the city, there are two huge rocks. One of them was rounded in shape. And he said the philosophers would get up on there and they would talk all day long. And then you could see it, but off in the distance was more of a flat rock. And he asked, who would meet there? And his tour guide said, the ecclesia, or the officials, or those who are called out to help run Jerusalem. So, as a normal Jew, someone that really wasn't worth much in the eyes of the Pharisees and Sadducees, Jesus called them the ecclesia, or the called out, or people that have importance. So he changed the world in that way. Also, something that Jesus did was that he made some people very, very mad. He made them mad enough to kill him. I've been mad before, but I've never been mad enough to kill someone. But Jesus made some people mad enough to kill him. And that gets us to where we are in our lesson. We're starting, after they go in the upper room and Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, we go to the garden scene. And something for reference, I asked Micah Urban yesterday how old he was. And Micah said he was 33 years old. So for reference, Micah Urban and Jesus Christ are the same age as this story is happening. So Jesus is a young man at 33 years old. So we get to the garden scene. They go to Gethsemane, which means olive press. So it is a place where they grow olives. And they go to the gate, and Jesus leaves 8 of his apostles there at the gate, and he brings 3 others with them. So 8 and 3 is 11, which means one of them is not there. We'll get to that one. We'll get to that one in a little bit. So they go into the garden, and Jesus knows what's about to happen, so he starts praying to God. And it's interesting that I read in Mark, that Mark states that Jesus, he uses the term greatly troubled. And I imagine that this might be the first time that the apostles have seen him like this. They've seen him upset. They've seen him sad and crying when Lazarus died. They've seen almost every emotion that you could possibly have. But I don't know if they've ever seen Jesus as troubled as he was in this moment. So this was a new experience for all the apostles with him. So Jesus goes into the garden and he prays. Can you see him? Can you see Jesus sweating, nervous, sorrowful? It's nighttime, so he's in the dark. Can you see him in this moment of agony? And he asks the Lord to take this cup from him, to take it away. But we know that the Father doesn't. And then he does something crazy, or in my mind crazy, because in this moment I would not be thinking about anyone else. But he prays for you and me. He prays for his followers and those that would come on after him. And then he goes and sees his apostles sleeping, and he does this 3 times. And at the 3rd time, he's talking to them, and then the 12th apostle comes, and there's a crowd with him. And Judas comes up and kisses Jesus on his cheek, and he says, "Hello, Rabbi." And in that moment, Jesus says back, "Do what you've come to do." And I couldn't imagine, in my mind, I think of Rodney and how I couldn't imagine Rodney, who is a friend of mine, coming to me and giving me a hug around the neck and giving a greeting, and me knowing what he's about to do and saying, "Friend, do what you've come to do." Because with that crowd, the crowd was watching Judas, watching who he was going to do that to. And the apostles are probably a little confused at this moment. Why is Judas coming with this crowd of people? And as soon as Judas kisses him and greets him, and Jesus says, "Let's do it," the apostles connect the dots in their mind that Jesus has said Judas was going to betray him. And then in that moment, all chaos breaks loose. It goes from a quiet moment of a greeting and Judas and Jesus talking to each other to the crowd trying to grab Jesus and the apostles pulling their swords and Peter cutting off the ear of someone. He was probably aiming to chop off his head, but he's a fisherman, so he probably doesn't have very good aim. And then you have all this chaos, and then also there's another moment where Jesus picks up the ear and puts it back on the head of that man. And he tells his apostles, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And at that moment they scatter. So they bind Jesus and they take him away, which leads us to the trial. Have you ever heard of an unfair trial? Someone go into a trial and they're not guilty, but then there's a guilty sentence, and you're like, man, that wasn't fair at all. That's what this trial is. Number one, it's in the dead of the night. which is something that is against their law. Only part of the Sanhedrin was there, which is against their law. And number three, I guess at that point, they bring several people that bring false accusations to Jesus. And you see this story of the Sanhedrin continually asking Jesus, "Are you the Son of God? Are you the Son of God? Are you the Son of God?" And him saying nothing at all, not answering him. And then all these false accusations come. "Are you the Son of God? Are you the Son of God?" And nothing. And finally they get someone that comes and says, he said he would destroy the temple in 3 days, or destroy the temple and build it again in 3 days. And that's something that Jesus had said. He had said it 3 years earlier when he drove the merchants out of the temple. So they ask him, "Are you the Son of God?" And he says, "You say that I am," which is a subtle yes, which is all that they needed. So at this point, the high priest rips his clothes because he had said that he had blasphemed against God. So they tie him up again. And I think it's interesting that the Sanhedrin, we read, slap him in the face. I don't know if all of them slapped him in the face, or if it was one man slapping him several times. I don't know. But we read that Jesus is slapped in the face. Peter had been following. Peter, who is the best friend of Jesus. And he had seen all this happen. And someone said, "Hey, Peter, aren't you Jesus' friend? Aren't you someone that associates with Jesus?" And Peter's like, No, I've never known the man. And it happens 3 times. And on the 3rd time, it says that Peter uses a curse, which means an oath. So for us, it would be the same as, "I swear on such and such, so-and-so's grave," whatever phrase you want to put in there, "I've never known the man." And at the 3rd time, the rooster crows, and Peter remembers what Jesus had said earlier. And then we get another moment where Peter and Jesus look at each other. And I don't know what Jesus' face was. I don't know if it was anger or disappointment or what. But the Greek word leans towards it being a penetrating stare. So something that cuts straight through Peter. And I think you don't know Jacob Mosley, but Jacob Mosley was the best man in my wedding. He currently lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and I cannot imagine, him being in a classroom and me standing outside the door and someone saying, "Aren't you friends with Joshua Hester?" "Yeah, you were the best man at his wedding. I've seen you around with him." And him denying me 3 times. And on the last one, saying an oath or a promise, "I've never known the man." And then me turning the corner and us meeting eyes just like Peter and Jesus did. So you have that moment, and Peter runs away and weeps bitterly. So the Jews have what they need to take him to Pilate. So they take him to Pilate. Now Pilate, as an official, number one, you're probably arrogant in the sense of you control everything under what you have jurisdiction under. But also, Caesar had already gotten on to Pilate several times for not ruling well. So you have someone who is arrogant and insecure all at the same time. And that brings us to Pilate. So the Jews bring him to Pilate, and they say, "This man has blasphemed. He has said that he is the king." So to Pilate, that didn't mean anything to him, that he said that he was the Son of God, because he wasn't a Jew in the first place, okay? And what the Jews did, what the Pharisees and Sadducees did, said that Jesus says he is the king of the Jews, which means that he is king over Caesar. Now that got Pilate's attention. So Pilate asked him, Of course, are you the king of the Jews? Are you who they say they are? Are you who they say you are? Yeah. And Jesus says, as he answered the Jews, you say that I am. And at this moment, Pilate gets a message from his wife. His wife has had a dream or vision saying, have nothing to do with that man, for he is righteous. And as we know, Pilate didn't listen to his wife. And it's at that moment, Pilate hears of Herod. Herod is over Galilee. So he's like, hey, Jesus is a Galilean. Let's send him to Herod. So they send him to Herod. I think it's interesting that what we read of, Herod is the only person through this whole process that Jesus does not say a word to. And it's because when he gets to Herod, Herod has heard of his miracles, and he's like, hey, Jesus, why don't you perform a miracle for me? Why don't you do a magic trick? Why don't you use your power? Show me. And like I said, we read that Jesus doesn't answer him at all. So Herod, being displeased with that, sends him back to Pilate. So at this point, Pilate is pretty much fed up with this whole situation. And he knew the Jewish tradition of every year at the Passover, the Jews would pardon someone, pardon a criminal. So imagine at that time one of the worst criminals you could think of, because he had led a riot and he had killed people and he had robbed people. So imagine someone, if the President of the United States wanted to pardon one of the worst criminals in U.S. history. That's where we're at right here. So Pilate brings up Barabbas and said, I can release him, a man that we all know has done wrong, or we can trade him in or release Jesus, who I think has done nothing wrong. And of course they say we want Barabbas. We want Barabbas to be released. So Pilate said, okay, maybe I can go beat him a little bit, scourge him, whip him, and maybe that would satisfy the Jews. But again, they say, we want Barabbas, or with Jesus, crucify him. And then we have this other moment of Pilate going to a bowl that was filled with water and washing his hands. Now, we aren't used to washing our hands in bowls. We're used to turning on the sink and then washing our hands and the water running off. And I understand that no literal blood was in this bowl, but figuratively speaking, imagine the red tint that was left in that bowl of Jesus' blood. Because that's what was on Pilate's hands, Jesus' blood. So he gives in to the crowd, and he said, all right, let's crucify him. But before the crucifixion, you have the pre-crucifixion, what I like to call humiliation or beating. So the Romans, they take Jesus, and they start off by probably chaining him to a post. I don't know how big that post was. Imagine me being chained right here to this podium. And they would rip the clothes off of him, and they would scourge him. To scourge is to whip, but it's more than that, because it wasn't just a regular whip that we think of with cowboys having, you know. It was a whip probably yay long, and on the end of it were pieces of bone or glass or whatever. And instead of like a whip as we know it, it whips you and it pops you. I guess an illustration of this would be, imagine me taking a piece of glass or a shard of glass and stabbing myself and then raking it across and just tearing everything that comes with it. So that's what they did to Jesus and his back. They would whip him and then drag it across. They also put a crown of thorns on his head. Now, my imagination of this is, at this point, Jesus has been beaten and bruised to the point where you might not be able to really recognize who he is. So in my mind, he's sitting on the ground, and they place this crown of thorns on his head, and they're not going to use their hands to push it on his head. You know, it's thorny. It would hurt their fingers. So I imagine they took a club or a stick or something, and I imagine 2 or 3 soldiers just bearing down as hard as they can onto Jesus' head. Then we have his crown of thorns. We also read that they continued to hit his head and to hit that crown of thorns. And then they put a purple robe on him, and they continue to make fun of him. They say, "Hail, King of the Jews." Look at this king right here. You call yourself a king? You've been beaten and a crown of thorns. You're no king. So, they're done with the pre-crucifixion beating. So now it's time to crucify him. So they put a cross on his back, and he's walking down the streets, people yelling and shouting, and I cannot imagine the commotion of Jerusalem on that day. So he's walking down the streets, and finally, Jesus' poor body, he can't hold it anymore, and he falls under his cross. So he gets someone to help him carry his cross. And I think it's interesting that Jesus tells us to pick up our cross daily and to carry our cross, but I cannot imagine being the person helping the Lord carry his cross. And I'm sure it was bloodied. I can imagine the Lord's blood being spilled on this person helping carry the Lord's cross. So they get to Golgotha, the place of the skull. Jesus is dragging his cross, and with the help, he throws it down, and I imagine a conversation. You got the nails? Okay, good. You got the hammer? Good. So they lay the cross down, and then they lay Jesus down, and they continued to nail our Lord to the cross through the wrists and through the hands. I wonder if he was silent or if he screamed out in pain. And at that moment, as he is now nailed to the cross, they would hoist him up. So people in the back pushing the cross and maybe a rope tied around the top, and they would pull him up. And the cross would be next to a hole, probably 2 or 3, 4 foot deep. So Jesus is up on the cross, and he's being lifted up, and he feels it tugging and maybe ripping a little more from his own body weight. And they inch him to the hole, and then boom, there's a sudden jerk as he's dropped down into that hole. And I can imagine him jostling and feeling the sudden jerk of that. And then come those spiritual leaders that we talk about, the Pharisees and Sadducees. That's when they come and they say, if you are really the Son of God, if you are who you say you are, just come on down. If you have all the power in the world, just use it. And then with that, the 2 criminals that were on either side, one of them says, yeah, if you're the Christ, get yourself down and get us all down. while you're at it. And the second man realizing. I think it's funny that no one there really knew who Jesus was, but a criminal, someone who had broken the law. And he looks at the other man and says, "Stop it. We deserve to be here." But Jesus doesn't. And then we have that line that Jesus says, "Today we will be in paradise together." They cast lots for his garments, which fulfills the prophecy. And another moment that I think of is that Jesus is up on the cross, and he looks down and he sees his mama. Now, I can imagine being in that moment and looking down and seeing my mother, and looks at the apostle with her and says, "Now, she is your mother, and you are her son. Take care of each other." I can't imagine being in the end and looking at my mama and looking at my friend and saying, "Now, take care of my mama." Then, he looks up to God. In this moment of all of this happenings, he looks up to God and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then they make fun of him again. He's calling for Elijah or calling for someone. And then, after hours of being on the cross, and every time you have to take a breath, you have to put pressure on that, because you have to lift yourself up. After 6 hours of that, I couldn't imagine 6 hours of that. After 6 hours of that, he looks up and he says, "It is finished." And that's it. That's all she wrote. He's dead. Do you see him? Someone who has been in the garden and prayed and sweat drops of blood, to his friend betraying him for 30 pieces of silver, and then being unfairly tried, to his best friend denying that he ever knew him, to a common criminal being chosen over him, to being beaten and scourged and placed with a crown of thorns, and carrying his cross and being nailed, dropped into that hole, and then being there for 6 hours. Someone that is covered in his sweat and their spit and his own blood. Can you see him? Now, imagine yourself in that same position. Imagine yourself up there on the cross. Imagine all of us. Imagine your children. Imagine your mama or daddy or brothers or sisters or spouse up there. And it's something that I say often, but that's what should have happened, or that's what was deserving of all of us. But luckily for us, the story doesn't end there, because Jesus was taken off the cross and he was buried, and 3 days later, the earth could not hold him. And just like death has lost its grip on Jesus, Satan has lost his grip on us. Because just as Jesus was raised from the dead, we can be raised from our spiritual death. And we deserve something worse than the cross. We deserve hell. But we have the opportunity to not have that because of what Jesus did. So I'm going to leave you with one question, one main question. And that is, have you forgotten that story? What I mean by that, have you forgotten to tell that story? And not like a nighttime, bedtime story, but something that actually happened. Something that is as real as we are, sitting and standing here right now. Have you forgotten that story? Have you forgotten to tell people? Do your coworkers know that story? Do your family members know that story? And most importantly, does your life look like that you remember that story? In your daily actions and the things that you do, would people know that you know that story? Or do you act like you've never heard that story before in your life? I pray that we live as if we recite that story to ourselves every single day. So like I said, I wasn't going to hit you over the head with my theological hammer. I was just going to preach to you Jesus. So if you have forgotten that story, or if you've never known that story before in your life, I pray that you come as we stand and as we sing.
Out of my